I'll jump right in with a few general words, and then we will eventually zero into doing some detailed listening of this quintet that is going to be performed this evening. Mozart wrote his quintet for clarinet and strings in September 1789. This was 2 years before his untimely death at the age of 36, and 8 years since he had been literally kicked out the door and dismissed from his position in the service of the Prince Archbishop of Salzburg. He had been unwilling to sup at the servants' table and was generally too insolent for a court underling. From 1781 until his death 10 years later, Mozart worked as a freelance musician in Vienna. This life, free of obligations to any one master, generally suited him, although he never stopped looking for regular employment at a court. He made his living, sometimes quite handsomely, sometimes more modestly, from a combination of aristocratic and courtly commissions, piano concerts, publications, and piano lessons, mostly to aristocratic young women. After a few years in Vienna, in 1787 actually, so he'd been there 6 years, Mozart's income was supplemented by a subvention from Emperor Joseph II, who created a position just for him that paid an annual sum approximately equal to twice that of his father's income in Salzburg. These figures, are a little bit hard to figure out what they meant in terms of standards of living, because, of course, the cost of living in Salzburg was much cheaper than that in Vienna. But I did want to point out that this was not an insignificant amount of money. This appears to have been the emperor's enticement for Mozart not to abandon Vienna. Although there were no official vacancies in the leading musical positions in Joseph II's court, the emperor seems to have recognized that Vienna was richer for having Mozart around. The position created for the composer carried no obligations beyond writing occasional dances for court balls. Since many of the best musicians in Vienna were in the regular employ of the court, which provided them with luxurious apartments and expensive clothes, Mozart himself imitated their lifestyle by spending lavishly on lodgings and clothes, which he could well afford in some years, but ill afford in others. Far from poor, Mozart was, however, frequently in debt, as his expenditures often exceeded his income. During Mozart's years in Vienna, the city was particularly renowned for its court opera and the court opera orchestra. The singers were among the finest in Europe, and the orchestra first-rate. Mozart made good use of the Catholic ban on opera and other dramatic entertainment during Lent by writing a series of piano concertos for himself to play in Lenten concerts with the members of the court opera orchestra, who were otherwise not occupied at that time. Particularly notable in these works is Mozart's writing for woodwinds, for flute, oboe, and bassoon in his early years in Vienna, which often act as soloists in dialogue with the piano. Beginning in the mid-1780s, Mozart began to include the clarinet in his piano concertos and chamber music. The invention of a German instrument maker in 1700, the clarinet was still something of a rarity until the last few years of the 18th century. It was the last woodwind to become a regular member of the standard orchestra. Mozart had loved the instrument since his first encounters with it in Mannheim and London during his childhood travels. One of his many complaints about Salzburg was that there were no clarinets there. His fondness for the instrument increased dramatically upon his acquaintance with his near contemporary Anton Stadler, the foremost clarinetist of the day, and beginning in 1787, the highest paid member of the Viennese court orchestra. Stadler was more than a musical colleague of Mozart's. He was a personal friend and a brother Freemason. He holds the singular, if dubious, distinction of being able to borrow money from Mozart even when Mozart was himself heavily in debt. All of Mozart's chamber music, including clarinet, as well as the clarinet solos in Mozart's late piano concertos and the operas The Marriage of Figaro, Così fan tutte, and La Clemenza di Tito, were written expressly for Stadler. And sometimes when Mozart traveled to other cities to have these works performed, Stadler was the only orchestral member he took with him, because this was still such a rare skill in those days on the clarinet. The Quintet for Clarinet and String Quartet, that is the main subject of my talk today, was written while Mozart was working on Così fan tutte, a gentle, heartfelt comedy about two pairs of young lovers. One of the most beautiful arias of the opera is the tenor's Un'aura amorosa, the text of which reads, "A breath of love from our darlings will bring sweet refreshment to our hearts. The heart that is nourished by the hope of love has no need of better food." This aria, which again was being composed at the same time as the quintet, shares much of the character of the slow movement of the quintet, and I just wanted to play a little bit of it for you so that you might get a sense when we compare the two. And if my technology will cooperate. What I've done is I've taken the part of the aria which is just past the middle, where the tenor goes from a somewhat high note and wanders down to begin the main tune. I'd just like you to hear a tiny bit of this. Here, but it's the clarinet that's sort of giving a kind of a heartbeat in the background. And I'd like you to compare that with what I consider to be the equivalent passage in the slow movement of the quintet. Again, the clarinet goes to a fairly high note and then meanders down and begins the main tune of the movement, which isn't exactly the same, but to me has the same quality as that aria. Now it's the strings that are kind of pulsing behind the clarinet. I've always felt that Mozart used the clarinet in his operas frequently, especially in slow movements or slow arias, with a sort of a special attention to a kind of an amorous quality. Like all of Mozart's mature chamber music, the clarinet quintet adheres to the conventions of late 18th century music at the same time as it gently explores new territory. In this case, the new aspects appear to be ingenious solutions to the challenges Mozart encountered in writing for clarinet with string quartet, a wonderful combination that seems never to have been used previously. I don't know of any other earlier examples, although this particular piece has engendered an entire repertoire following it. The overall structure of the work is the same as one is likely to find in any late 18th century string quartet or symphony, and consists of 4 movements in the following arrangement. We have a few, just 2, I think, more handouts where I list some of the things I'm going to discuss. Does anyone need one of these? in the back there. Maybe if a couple people can share. I've only got those two more. So the four movements are, and this is the first thing I've listed on the handout, the first movement is a fairly fast movement of what I call considerable rhetorical weight, and I'll be returning to what I mean by that. The second movement is a slow movement of lyrical beauty. That's what we just heard a little bit of. The third movement is a minuet, which was the most popular aristocratic dance of Mozart's day. And it was a very, very, very long-lived dance. It had already been popular throughout Europe for quite some time. And the fourth movement is a fairly fast movement, lighter in tone than the first movement, although sometimes similar in various ways, but generally with somehow a lighter lilt to it. For the bulk of the remaining time, although perhaps not all, I would like to discuss the first movement in some detail, which I hope will help you to understand a bit more of Mozart's compositional strategies. Now, the opening of the first movement is, in my opinion, one of Mozart's most ingenious, because clearly he's thought very carefully about how to deploy these forces of the clarinet with the string quartet. And one of the things that I love about almost all of Mozart's work, but it comes from his work in the theater, his work writing comic opera, is the way he can change, I call it turning on a dime. He can change the mood of the music. And in this very brief opening, you will hear first the strings play something akin to a hymn. I call it a hymn because all the instruments are working together in the same rhythmic pattern. It feels a bit penitential. And then all of a sudden, there's a livelier accompaniment, and you notice that it's only the first violin now that's really carrying the tune. And then you barely have a chance to get used to that, and all of a sudden, the clarinet comes in and does something entirely different. It sort of does a big sweep up and down. Almost, I call it a fanfare, but it's really a lot more elegant than a fanfare. So let's listen and see if we can hear these events. They should be quite clear. And once they happen once, then they happen nearly identically again. And that's a great trademark of Mozart, a kind of a balancing trademark, very typical of music of this period. So let's just hear the opening here. A little bit of a hymn. A little more lively. And now again. So, again, very short, very natural, and yet full of detail that switches the mood very quickly from one aspect to another. The effect of these opening bars is to introduce the distinctive voices of the quartet and the clarinet by presenting them separately and with distinctive musical materials. Mozart sets up a challenge. How will these two performing forces and materials interact and, we expect if we're experienced musicians, find unity in the course of the movement? Now, Mozart takes up this challenge in the context of a musical structure known as sonata form. And I'd like to go into some depth on sonata form with you. The nearly ubiquitous form of first movements of instrumental music in this time is called sonata form. And I should say that the word sonata is a very general one. It just comes from the word sonore, to sound, which would have been used in opposition to the word cantare, or to sing. In other words, sonata simply means music for instruments as opposed to music that would have been sung, or vocal music. But as the 18th century wore on, there grew to be a convention of the way that one would write first movements, the kind of events you would expect to hear in this position. And in honor of the word sonata, it became known as sonata form. Now, sonata form has three main large sections, and you've got them written down here, but I want to write them on the board for one moment. In abbreviation: exposition, development, and recapitulation. Now, the reason that I've written them this way is because from my description of them, you would think of this as a three-part form. But in fact, composers were really thinking in a two-part way, because the exposition is repeated and therefore is really approximately the same length as these other two sections put together. So we like to talk about this as a binary form, even though we give three words to describe the different sections here. This will become clearer as I go on. Now, the exposition conventionally consists of four distinct sections, and they are not always as clearly defined, perhaps, as I may make them seem now, but they can almost always be ferreted out by people if you listen very closely. And I've listed them for you on the handout. The first theme, or group of themes, transitional material, which we often call a bridge, which leads to a cadence or a resting point, and then a second theme or group of themes, and closing material. We have already been listening to the first theme area. In fact, we've just listened to the entire first theme. It's not very long, but notice that it has that balanced presentation, which helps you remember it. Now, if I were teaching a music theory class, I would go into a lot of detail about how the function of the first theme is not only to give you memorable material, but also to establish the key of the piece. Here I'll just mention that that's the case. And we identify the bridge or the transition section when, in fact, and this is often done very craftily and it's hard to perceive, when the composer starts to move into a different key area. That's the transition. And then the second theme is then firmly in this new key area, which has been sort of plowed by the bridge material. Now, often this bridge material would be your first real forte. It would be kind of like a storm had started in the movement, and that's a kind of a technique that composers often use to either signal, or you might even say to kind of fake out, have people not notice that they're modulating. In any case, it often goes together with modulation. However, here, and I believe that this is due to the particular playing qualities of Anton Stadler, Mozart's clarinetist, here the bridge starts actually rather gently. And we only get this kind of agitation that is conventional for bridge sections at the very end of this section. Another thing that's unusual about it is that instead of starting the bridge with new material to take us elsewhere, it actually keeps on coming back to that hymn material we've already heard, although it's a little bit hidden because above the hymn material there are embellishments. First by the clarinet, then followed by the cello and the violin. After we get this embellished version with the hymn material behind it, it does eventually then get more agitated, and we come to a real stopping point. And that stopping point is quite obligatory for this form. And it's what sets up then your expectation of the second theme. So now I will play from the beginning of the movement and point out these various sections to you. So we're going to start with that first theme again. In some way, you might think the clarinet isn't really listening to the strings. Now, here's the bridge. Listen to the strings behind it. There's actually that hymn is behind there, covered by the clarinet. Now the cello. And you can hear the hymn better in the violins now. Violins are always a little more active. Now the clarinet tries to take us somewhere else. So that was it. That was really that emphatic close, which signals the end of the bridge. And you may not have noticed it, but it sets us up now for a new key. Again, even if you're not familiar with music and you don't have a good sense of what key means, what Mozart is doing here is he's finding ways to keep the music fresh for you. So you may not notice it, but if you're not getting tired of it, one of the reasons is that he's actually keeping on refreshing notes for you by taking you through these harmonic machinations. Now, the only technical requirement, if you had, I expect, asked Mozart or one of his contemporaries, what is a requirement for a second theme, I suspect he would have said, oh, it just should be in a different key, probably in, the dominant or maybe the relative major, than the first theme. But in fact, people who've studied these things have noticed that the second theme tends to have a somewhat more singing or cantabile quality than the first theme. That's a bit odd, since I've already used a vocal metaphor for describing the first theme, a hymn, but here now maybe it's more of a solo song that is a good way of describing the second theme. Now again, with this second theme, Mozart does something that I do not know of in any other piece of his or any other composer for that matter. And that is, he states it twice, fairly differently. Once in the violin, the second time in the clarinet. And when he does it in the clarinet, there's a big color change. And he puts it in, at least in the beginning of it, into a minor key, although overall we're working in the context of major. Again, there seems to have been something about the color of the clarinet that was inspiring him to come up with these not common solutions to sonata form. I want to point out to you one other thing about this cantabile theme. And this is something that I've noticed used by composers from many, many different centuries, but I love it when it happens, which is that a kind of a singing theme is offset by pizzicato much lower down. So now we have the plucking, pizzicato of the cello underneath. There's some string accompaniment in the middle, and the violin singing above. And that combination seems to really highlight the legato of the violin phrase, the sort of pointillistic accompaniment in the bass. So let's listen to this, and I'll point it out, but I hope you'll also be able to hear this color change when the clarinet comes in. I'll back up just a tiny bit so that we can hear that emphatic close to the bridge section. I'll take you back a bit. Here we go. Don't know what it is, but it's special, right? Now, after the clarinet gets through with this relaxed stuff, we're going to start to build. And these builds usually signal that we're coming to the end of a section. What we're going on, this is called the closing theme. And notice the way it rests on the repeated notes of the cello. I wanted to stop it there. We're almost at the end of the exposition, because then again, Mozart does something which I would say is not entirely unknown in his other work, but it's a kind of thing that Beethoven would really pick up on, which is, as a closing flourish, he again returns to the hymn part of that first theme, and then allows the clarinet to do a virtuosic thing that brings this whole section to a close. So I just want to go back a little bit to hear some of that again, and then I'll point out that codetta or tag to this closing section. This is the build. This is technically then the end of the second theme, closing theme. Now, the next thing that happens in sonata form is exactly the same thing all over again. Everything that we've heard is literally repeated. You go back and you read from the top. Now, I should say that this is rather confusing to the way a lot of 19th century and later people like to think about music. They like to think of a continuous narrative unfolding. And this repeat of a giant section tended to sort of throw a wrench into this notion of continual storytelling. Or, to use another analogy, oration, which often this form has been described as being part of. You might have one version of the argument as your first theme, and another version of the argument as your second theme, a sort of peroration, the closing theme. These might be analogous, but then you would never just go back and start reading from the top of your speech again. Historically, though, this tells us something, which is that the origins of these instrumental forms are generally in dance music. Before instrumental music became concert music and you would actually go and listen to it, it was mainly functional. It was to accompany dance or something. And dances tend to need quite a lot of repeats because you never know how long the dancers want to go on. And so you always need to have an option of going back to a certain place and doing it again. In a little bit, we're going to just take a small look at a minuet, which is the third movement, and we'll be able to see traces of that there. I think that I would like to now skip that repeat of the exposition and remind you on that sheet of paper all the events that happen. And now I would like to skip, you can turn over to the development section. Now, the English term development is a very rough translation of what 18th century German musicians called Arbeit, or work. The term refers to working, or what we would call developing, material presented in the exposition. I think you will be able to tell what material is being worked with. So let me play you a little bit of it, and then we will discuss it some more. So now we're going to skip to the beginning of the development, which starts again with a lovely kind of a color change. I might just have the last few seconds of the second time through the exposition here. That's the end of the exposition, second time, and clearly marked. Color change. Clarinet emerges, and now we've heard that before, right? Oh, we've heard that before. So I keep on saying we've heard this before because in a sense we have. You can detect that what we first got was a sort of hymn section of the first theme, and now that's the kind of fanfare part of the first theme. But did you notice, I may have written it on the chart, that the roles have been switched. Now it's the clarinet that is taking the hymn part, and it's the strings that are doing the fanfare part. Showing you, in some sense, people wearing maybe not their natural hats, or maybe we've actually progressed to a more natural state. But developments don't generally feel all that natural, because what's going on is that after that first statement of the hymn theme, we're only taking now fragments of the first theme, and they're being repeated in an imitative fashion, first in the violin, then, say, in the viola or the cello, then in the second violin. They keep on coming in one after another. And again, this kind of busyness or action is often a signal, and it is here, of a rapid changing through of keys, which is characteristic of the development section. So what we're going to hear now is a lot of body da dee da dee 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 body dee 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 body dee dee, a lot of that, and then after a while we're not going to get even all of that. We're just going to get and again it's going to be broken apart, broken down. This is called fragmentation. This is work. Okay, this is what is meant by that word Arbeit or development in this section. And now I want to point out a very special section. At the very end of the development section, the busyness is going to go away, but you still won't feel settled. And then there's going to be this golden little second of a moment where Mozart is going to take you through expectation and release. And this is one of the most dramatic parts of sonata form. It is how do you get to the recapitulation, the restatement of the first theme, now in its home key. And Mozart does this in a very special way because he gets the clarinet up on a note and he lets it hang there. And the violins do some busyness underneath to increase the tension. And then without knowing it, all of a sudden, that note that the clarinet has just been hanging out on, in fact, becomes the initiation of the hymn theme. This, it seems to me, was the moment that Mozart was really planning from the outset, from the time that he put the hymn theme only in the strings and this answer only in the clarinet. Now all the instruments come together and do it just at the time when Mozart has orchestrated a harmonic release. So let's listen all the way through the development section, and it's really not too long, and then we'll get that great moment. I don't know why this doesn't want to cooperate with me. Here. Him in the clarinet. But we're not in the right key. It's wonderful, but we're not. Yeah. Lots of imitation. Clarinet arpeggiating, but only the down part of the fanfare in the strings. Kind of stormy. Listen to the clarinet. Things are clearing. That's the recapitulation. I want to point out one little detail. So I've already talked about the way now the clarinet gets the theme. And almost in celebration of the unity, notice that the clarinet sort of jumps for joy at one place. I want to point this out to you. And then I want to also say, what did we use so much of in the development? Well, all that fanfare-like material. So Mozart is clearly aware of this, because one of the small modifications he uses in the recapitulation is he doesn't focus on that anymore. It appears very briefly, but it's gone in a flash. So clearly he understands that he's used up that material, and he moves on more quickly to other things. So just for a second, so I will point out what I consider the clarinet kind of doing a little jig. Again, retransition. All is well with the world, right? That's it. So, with some minor adjustments, the recapitulation then repeats exactly the material of the exposition. I see that we have a bit more time, so what I'd like to do is give you just a few reflections on instrumental music at this time, and then give you little tastes of the two movements that we haven't listened to at all, the Minuet and the theme and variations at the end. Instrumental concert music, that is, instrumental music intended to hold the attention of an audience, as opposed to as accompaniment for dance, as background music, or as music used to accompany ritual. So these were the most common uses of instrumental music prior to the end of the 18th century. And just to give you an example, in the mid-18th century, there was an extremely famous orchestra kept by the Elector of Bavaria in his court at Mannheim. And there were 2 times a week concerts there in a beautiful, ornate hall. And what you were expected to do during the concerts was go have something to drink, and play cards and bet while the orchestra was playing. Or probably, if you wanted to be antisocial, you could read. Okay? But by the time we get to a piece like this, you are actually expected to listen to it more or less in the fashion that we listen to concerts today. And the change wasn't only a change in social convention, it was also a change in the inherent interest and intricacy of this instrumental music. So the ability to hold an audience rapt in the abstract medium of instrumental music, that is, music without accompanying text to convey meaning, depended on composers finding increasingly dramatic ways to work with harmony and other musical materials to sustain movements over long stretches of time. And that first movement is about, I don't know, around 9 minutes long, which is actually a pretty long time to sustain an uninterrupted flow. The notion of Arbeit, or development, was a crucial tool in the dramatic arsenal of Mozart and his contemporaries. It allowed for periods of great tonal and textual contrast that made the return of the opening material in its original form especially satisfying. No wonder that the generation of intellectuals who came to age in the 1790s, when Mozart's music was celebrated throughout Europe, claimed for the first time that instrumental music was in fact highly pregnant with meaning. So this is a process where Mozart is perhaps not the instigator, but he's one of the most important early practitioners of concert music, making it worthy of being the true focus of our attention. And here I mean an audience's attention, because for a long time also instrumental music had been there for the player. And it still was, of course, there for the player as the primary consumer of the work. But now we're moving more towards the audience. So I thought, now that I've said that this form comes from a dance form, that I should show you a little bit of what I mean by taking you into the third movement, which is the minuet. By the way, the word minuet, you all know, it just means minute or small, just the same as a minute is a small bit of time, and it refers to the dainty small steps of the dance. You might contrast it with another dance in 3/4, a waltz, but a waltz is quite different because in the waltz you spin. It actually refers to the word for rotating in German. And there, you know, the petticoats and the dresses might go up a little bit, and you might actually see some ankle, which was much written about at the time, the degeneration of young people in the early 19th century with this newfangled dance, the waltz. The minuet had rather aristocratic associations, again, because of the intricate, minute steps. Now, minuets are constructed, as I've already said, with repeats. And I wanted to show you the first repeat comes up very quickly in this minuet of Mozart's, and I will point it out to you. Then you will notice that there is a section which is actually, it doesn't do, please come. It doesn't do all the kind of work that I was describing and breaking apart of themes, but in some sense it is a little bit analogous to this section here. So we're going to hear a very quick section that gets repeated. Then we're going to hear a bit of different material, not too different, but a little. And then we are going to have a little moment here right before we come back. I wouldn't use these terms, by the way, exposition, development, or recapitulation, in relation to the minuet. It's too small, actually, to be using them. But this analogy will be clear to you as I point it out. There is a moment of retransition here, and then we get the opening material again. And then this whole section, right, can be repeated as many times as the hostess requires. Okay, let's listen to this. It's rather buttoned up, right? That was it. Now we're repeating it. Now we're going to go on and do something a little different. A little noodling. Need some variety. This is the retransition. Now we're repeating that first theme again. It repeats. So I'm gonna stop that so you can see that this is in fact the model from which that whole big form of the sonata grows. Now, I was making a little bit of a joke that you could repeat this as many times as you wanted, although in fact the musicians would have to keep an eye on the dance floor and decide what they were going to do. But what was the habit, actually, of dance composers at this time was to compose several minuets in a row and have them all played in a row and alternate them. The first minuet was always called the minuet. And then any additional minuets were, for some reason, called trios. Now, actually, the reason they're called trios is because often they have a reduction in the forces that play them. So if it was a quartet, maybe, then you would have fewer people in the trio. Here, what Mozart does is he makes two trios. And after each trio, you always come back and do this minuet again. The first trio is for the string quartet all alone, no clarinet at all. So I'll give you a little taste of this by just letting now this minuet run to its close, and then you'll get a sense of the contrast inherent in the trio. This is the retransition part. This is the first trio. It's danced exactly the same way, only the music contrasts. So it's not unheard of to have more than one trio, but it is quite rare in chamber music. But Mozart does two trios in this piece, and it's quite clear that he does it again to make use of these two forces, the string quartet and the clarinet. And the clarinet, what we haven't heard, and which isn't so much its association from that love music in Così fan tutti that I played for you at the beginning, but the clarinet also had sort of rural pastoral associations. And that's what you really hear in this second trio, which features the clarinet. Again, people's dance steps may well have stayed the same because the meter actually stays the same, but the emphasis within the meter changes a good deal, and it sounds a bit more like a Ländler, which is just a German word for a more rustic dance, something that they do out in the land, right, in the where the peasants are. That's why it's called a Ländler. Let me see if I can find where this is. Yes. So here you will notice quite a bit of contrast now in feel. And again, now we go back to featuring the clarinet. Actually, now you can it's almost a waltz. Makes you kind of want to swing around. So each one of these contrasting sections always returns to the minuet, and at the very end you return to the minuet, and then the conclusion of the minuet is in fact the end of that whole piece. I'll just take 2 or 3 minutes to talk a little bit about the last movement, which is a theme and variations. In fact, the theme of the theme and variations also in miniature imitates this same form that we have up here, although again it's really quite short. The point of a theme that you're going to vary is that it be very memorable and very clear. So I think you'll find this theme of Mozart's rather whistleable and hummable, something that you won't forget. Mozart is very crafty here. He only brings the clarinet in to sort of help round off the phrases, but it doesn't have a big role in the theme itself. It has a big role in various of the variations. In some of the variations, you can hear the theme going on in the background. In others, you can't. The mood is quite different. But if you wanted to count the lengths of the various parts of all of the variations, you would find that they're always identical to the theme. So it's really the proportions and the phrase lengths that Mozart always keeps consistent in the theme and variation. So I'm just going to count through with you. And again, this isn't, I wouldn't use these terms, exposition, development, recapitulation, at all for the theme. But you'll see there's a section that gets repeated, there's a slight contrast, and then we come back exactly to this material at this position. It's a very good and productive structure. That's what I mean by light. First phrase, second phrase. Repeat. 2, 3, 4, plus 1, 2, 3, 4. Little contrast. But also 4 bars long. Oh, we returned. Contrast. A little more legato. I'll let it go a little bit into the first variation. Hear the tune and the strings. You're maybe not supposed to focus on the theme, right? So I hope I've whetted your appetite. I hope you can make it this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure. Please feel free to come ask me questions if you have them. Our time is up, but thank you for your attention.